You don't get disrespected by accident. It's usually negotiated in silence, in small moments you ignored. And once you see it clearly, you don't unsee it. If you are new here, this is not entertainment. It's observation. And if you've been here before, you already understand the direction this kind of clarity takes you. Enable subtitles if you want to catch every layer, because some of what you're about to hear doesn't land on the surface the first time. Now listen closely. There are words people use that don't just communicate meaning. They reposition you in someone's mind. And there are also words people avoid that quietly signal permission for disrespect to continue. Most people never notice this shift. They think disrespect is about tone, volume, or confidence. It's not. It's about psychological positioning, and language is the tool that sets that position long before emotion enters the room. Think about the last time someone interrupted you mid-sentence. They didn't do it because they were louder. They did it because, in their perception of you, your sentence didn't carry weight strong enough to require patience. That is the part nobody likes to admit. There is a hidden economy in human interaction. Respect is the currency, and most people are constantly overspending it just to be liked, to avoid tension, or to keep things smooth. But smooth interactions often come at the cost of authority. And authority is not something you claim with force. It is something others subconsciously assign to you based on signals you give without noticing. Words are the strongest of those signals. There are 7 specific words or word types that act like psychological locks. When used correctly, they don't create conflict. They end it before it forms. Not through aggression, but through finality. Through a quiet message that says, this boundary is not negotiable, and you are not confused about it. But before those words make sense, you need to understand what disrespect actually is. Disrespect is not always insult. It's not always hostility. More often, it's testing. A subtle push to see how much of your space, time, or attention can be taken without consequence. Someone talks over you once. You laugh it off. They do it again. You adjust your tone. They do it a third time. You start over explaining yourself, trying to regain control through clarity. And by that point, the dynamic is already set. You are no longer in a conversation. You are in permission mode. This is where most people lose ground without realizing it. They think being reasonable will fix how they are treated. But reason without boundaries is just negotiation from a lower position. There is a reason certain people rarely get tested twice. Not because they are aggressive, but because their language signals closure, not discussion when limits are crossed. And this is where the shift begins. Imagine a man in a meeting. He is calm, measured, not loud. Someone interrupts him midpoint. He pauses, not dramatically, just enough for silence to become noticeable. Then he continues exactly where he stopped, without acknowledging the interruption. No apology, no irritation, no explanation. What just happened there is not social confidence. It is linguistic control. He did not argue for respect. He assumed the frame where interruption was irrelevant. Now contrast that with the person who gets interrupted and says, sorry, I was saying, that word, sorry, is not always wrong. But in that context, it subtly reinforces the idea that your speech was optional enough to be paused without consequence. Over time, patterns like this accumulate. People don't consciously decide to disrespect you. They simply follow the pattern your responses allow. This is why certain words carry weight beyond their dictionary meaning. They act like psychological endpoints, signals that a line has been reached. And when used correctly, they don't escalate tension. They remove it. But here is where things get uncomfortable. Most people cannot use these words effectively because they are emotionally attached to being liked. They fear that clarity will create distance. So instead, they choose softness. They choose explanation. They choose delay. And every time they do, they trade authority for approval. You've probably noticed this in yourself without naming it. The moment you feel slightly disrespected, there is a split second where you know you should respond differently. Not louder, just clearer. But you hesitate. You adjust. You soften it. That hesitation is where your position shifts. Because human beings don't just respond to what you say. They respond to what you tolerate. There is a reason some conversations end quickly and cleanly while others spiral into justification, emotional noise, and exhaustion. It is not intelligence. It is boundary language. And boundary language is not about volume. It is about finality. At this point, you might assume this is about being cold or distant. It's not. It's about precision. The kind that prevents unnecessary social friction because it removes ambiguity early. Ambiguity is where disrespect grows. If someone is unsure whether they can push you, they will test it. Not maliciously, naturally. That is how social systems work. But when your language removes uncertainty, testing stops. Now, the strange part is this: the most intimidating people in any room rarely raise their voice. They rarely argue. They rarely chase validation through explanation. Instead, they use short, precise verbal boundaries that end interaction loops instantly. Not because they are trying to dominate, but because they refuse to participate in unclear dynamics. And this is where the real shift in perception begins. Because once you understand that respect is not demanded but structurally produced through communication patterns, you stop reacting emotionally to disrespect. You start observing it as information. Information about how your presence is being interpreted. And that interpretation is shaped more by what you say in small moments than what you declare in big ones. There are specific words that interrupt that interpretation. Words that reset the dynamic without escalation. Words that don't invite negotiation. But if you expect them to sound powerful in the dramatic sense, you will miss their real effect. Their strength is in restraint, in calm refusal, in quiet certainty. And before revealing them, you need to understand something else that most people overlook. Disrespect doesn't persist because people are bold. It persists because responses are inconsistent. One moment you tolerate something, the next moment you resist it. That inconsistency creates confusion, and confusion invites repetition. Human behavior always tests boundaries where clarity is missing. So when you finally hear these words, don't think of them as tricks. Think of them as alignment tools. Language that brings your external world in sync with your internal standard. Because without that alignment, you end up living in constant negotiation with people who have already decided your position in their mind. And that is where things become difficult to reverse. There is a reason some people suddenly change how others treat them after a certain point in life. It is rarely appearance, rarely status. It is communication refinement, the removal of excess explanation, the introduction of finality. But to reach that point, you have to stop using language that invites further discussion when none is required. Because every unnecessary explanation is an open door, and some doors should close without ceremony. Now, in the next part, we move into the exact words that carry this psychological weight. Not as aggression, but as controlled endings to disrespect patterns that most people unconsciously allow to continue. And once you hear them, you will start noticing how often you've been leaving those doors open without realizing it. There is a point in human interaction where silence becomes more powerful than explanation, and clarity becomes more effective than persuasion. Most people never reach that point because they are trained to keep things understood, even when they are being repeatedly crossed. What you are about to understand is not vocabulary. It is structure, language that doesn't argue for respect, but removes the possibility of continued disregard. And if you pay attention closely, you will notice something uncomfortable. These words are not complicated. They are simple, almost disappointingly simple, but their effect depends entirely on whether you've already trained people to see you as someone who finishes what they start socially. Let's begin with the first shift. There is a moment when someone pushes your boundary and waits to see your reaction. Most people fill that moment with noise. They explain, they soften, they try to preserve comfort. But there is a word that does the opposite. It ends the loop immediately. Enough. Not louder, not emotional, just final. When used correctly, it doesn't invite agreement. It signals completion. The conversation is no longer expanding. It has reached its limit. And the nervous system of the other person registers that faster than their logic does. But here is what matters more than the word itself, the pause before it. Because enough, spoken in reaction, is weak. Enough, spoken from control, is structural. It tells the other person that the threshold was already decided internally, and they are only now catching up to it. Most people never use this correctly because they are still trying to win social approval while setting boundaries. That contradiction weakens everything. Now move deeper. The second word is not about ending conversation. It is about refusing entry into manipulation loops that disguise themselves as misunderstandings. Stop. Simple. Direct. Often avoided because it feels too sharp for people who were taught to be agreeable. But stop is not aggression. It is interruption of pattern. It prevents escalation before it matures into argument. When someone repeats behavior that you already silently disapproved of, most people tolerate it twice, then express frustration on the third time. By then, the pattern is already established. But stop used early disrupts the pattern before it becomes identity. And here is the psychological truth most people miss. People do not respond to your emotions as much as they respond to your consistency. A calm stop delivered consistently rewires how they engage with you over time. Not because they fear you, because they can no longer predict inconsistency in your tolerance. Now, the third word operates differently. It removes the emotional anchor from the interaction entirely. Noted. At first, it sounds passive, almost dismissive. That is exactly why it is powerful. Because many disrespect patterns rely on pulling you into emotional engagement. They want reaction. They want debate. They want explanation. Noted. Denies all of that. It acknowledges without participation. It removes fuel. Someone tries to provoke justification. You respond with, noted. The entire emotional architecture collapses because there is nothing left to escalate. But this only works when you are not using it sarcastically. Not defensive. Not bitter. It has to be neutral. Observational. Detached. Because what you are actually communicating is this. I have registered this behavior, and I am not investing further energy into it. That is where its weight comes from. Now, before moving further, understand something subtle. None of these words work in isolation if your internal standard is inconsistent. They are not magic phrases. They are alignment tools. They only work when your behavior outside of speech matches the boundary you were signaling. Otherwise, they become empty performance. And people sense performance instantly, even if they cannot articulate it. Let's continue. The fourth word is used when someone tries to reframe your boundary as something negotiable. Clear. Not as a question, not as a request, as a statement of resolution. When confusion is manufactured to reopen discussion, clear shuts it down without hostility. It signals that there is no misunderstanding from your side. The ambiguity is not yours to solve. This is important because many disrespect patterns survive through manufactured confusion. People act as if they didn't mean it that way, or it was just a joke, or you misunderstood. Clear removes that escape route. It does not accuse, it finalizes understanding. And the moment understanding is finalized, manipulation loses space to operate. Now, the fifth word carries a different weight entirely. It is not about interruption. It is about removal. Leave. Few people use this early enough. Most wait until frustration peaks. By then, the environment has already shaped the interaction too deeply. Leave is not emotional. It is environmental correction. It does not argue. It resets space. And when used without emotional buildup, it communicates something very specific. Presence is conditional on respect, not on endurance. But here is where most people hesitate. They fear social discomfort more than structural disrespect. So they delay this word until it feels dramatic. And by then, the authority behind it is already weakened. The real power of leave is not in forcing exit. It is in making continuation unnecessary. Now pause here internally for a moment. Because if you are following closely, you may notice a pattern forming underneath all of this. These words are not about confrontation. They are about closing loops that should never remain open in the first place. And yet, most people spend their entire lives inside open loops, hoping time will fix what language never addressed. That hope is why disrespect persists longer than it should. Now, there is a psychological turn here that matters. At some point, you will realize that people do not test you randomly. They test you where your language is uncertain, where your responses are emotionally variable, where your boundaries are implied instead of stated. And once that becomes clear, you stop reacting to disrespect as if it is unpredictable. You start seeing it as predictable feedback to unclear signals. That shift changes everything, because instead of feeling targeted, you start seeing structure. And structure can be corrected. There is one more layer before we move forward. A subtle one. Even with these words, your delivery must remain calm. Not because calm is polite, but because calm removes drama from the equation. Drama invites resistance. Calm closes negotiation. You are not trying to convince anyone. You are setting a boundary that does not require approval. And if that sounds unfamiliar, it is because most people were trained to associate boundaries with conflict. In reality, unclear boundaries create more conflict than clear ones ever will. Now, in the next segment, the remaining words will shift from interruption to psychological finality. Words that don't just end behavior, but reframe how people categorize you in their mind long-term. And once that happens, you stop managing disrespect moment by moment. You stop encountering it in the same way altogether. There is a moment in social dynamics where you stop reacting to disrespect and start recognizing its source before it fully forms. That shift is not confidence. It is pattern recognition refined through restraint. Most people never reach it because they stay focused on controlling individual incidents instead of controlling the language that produces those incidents in the first place. And once you see that clearly, something changes in how you respond. You stop negotiating your position mid-conversation. You start defining it before the conversation even stabilizes. Now we continue with the next layer of words. The sixth word is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is structurally final in a different way. Understood. This is where most people misunderstand the power of communication. They think, understood, is agreement. It is not. It is closure without emotional participation. When someone tries to pull you into repeated justification, explanation, or emotional reframing, understood, ends the loop without opening another one. But its real strength is not in what it says. It is in what it refuses to do. It refuses to argue. It refuses to clarify further. It refuses to extend the interaction into emotional territory. And that refusal is what creates psychological distance. Because disrespect often survives on continued engagement. Not because the content is strong, but because the interaction stays open. Understood shuts the interaction without hostility. It signals that processing has already happened internally, and no additional input is required. But there is a subtle mistake people make when they try to use this. They say it to prove composure, not to end engagement. That difference matters. If it is spoken with the intention of being perceived as calm, it becomes performance. If it is spoken as a natural endpoint, it becomes structure. People around you will feel that difference even if they cannot explain it. Now move deeper. The seventh word is the most misunderstood because it is not about communication at all. It is about removal of access. Done. There is no negotiation inside this word. No emotional continuation. No hidden invitation to revisit the topic. It signals final disengagement from a pattern, not just a moment. Most people only use it after emotional overload. After frustration builds. After they feel pushed beyond tolerance. In that state, it becomes reactive and loses authority. But when used early, calmly, and without emotional buildup, it communicates something very different. The pattern itself is no longer eligible for continuation. This is where psychological positioning becomes irreversible in the short term. Because people adjust quickly to emotional reactions. They do not adjust easily to non-negotiable closure without escalation. Done does not demand understanding. It removes participation. And what follows is often silence from the other side, not because they are defeated, but because the interaction has lost its structure for continuation. Now, let's step back for a moment and observe what has actually been built here. None of these words rely on aggression. None of them require dominance. None of them depend on volume or intimidation. What they depend on is consistency of internal standard expressed through minimal language. And that is where most people struggle. Because they try to fix disrespect externally while leaving internal tolerance unchanged. So they change tone. They change explanations. They even change body language, but they never change the actual threshold of what they allow before responding. That is why the same patterns repeat in different environments, with different people, under different circumstances. The common variable is not others. It is response structure. And once you begin to see that, your attention shifts from, how do I stop this person from disrespecting me, to, what signal did I just send that allowed this interaction to continue this way? That is a more uncomfortable question. But it is also the more useful one. Because it places responsibility back into controllable territory. Now there is something else that becomes visible at this stage. People who frequently experience disrespect are often not lacking strength. They are lacking termination language. They can defend themselves. They can argue. They can even win conflicts. But they cannot end patterns cleanly. And because of that, their interactions often restart at the same emotional level every time, regardless of outcome. That repetition creates exhaustion more than the disrespect itself. Now consider something more precise. When your language begins to consistently end loops instead of extending them, something subtle changes in how people interact with you. They begin to adjust their behavior before testing limits. Not because they fear consequences, but because your responses remove uncertainty. Uncertainty is what invites testing. Clarity removes it. And clarity is not volume. It is linguistic finality delivered without emotional instability. At this point, there is a temptation to turn all of this into technique. To memorize words and apply them mechanically. That would miss the deeper function entirely. These words only work when they reflect an already established internal boundary. Otherwise, they feel forced. And forced language creates friction instead of respect. So the real transformation is not in what you say. It is in what you no longer feel obligated to explain. Because explanation is often where authority dissolves. Not in conflict, but in over-clarification. Every time you explain something that does not require explanation, you downgrade your position slightly in the interaction. Not visibly, but structurally. And over time, those small adjustments accumulate into a pattern of how others interpret your presence. Now, there is one final layer before we move to transformation. If you begin applying this correctly, you will notice something unexpected. Some people will distance themselves without conflict. Not because you became harsh, but because they relied on your previous tolerance for structure. When that tolerance disappears, the interaction no longer functions the same way for them. That is not loss. That is exposure of dependency dynamics you were previously maintaining without awareness. And that is where the real shift begins. Because once you stop participating in patterns that require your silence to continue, your environment naturally reorganizes around clarity instead of assumption. In the final segment, this all consolidates into a single principle of psychological positioning. What actually changes how people treat you long-term, beyond any individual word. And once you understand that, these 7 words stop being tools. They become unnecessary. Because your presence alone begins to communicate the boundary before language is even needed. At this point, the mistake would be to think the power was in the words themselves. It was never there. Words only expose structure. They do not create it. They reveal whether your internal boundary is already formed or whether you are improvising respect in real time. And people can sense the difference faster than they can explain it. There is a reason some individuals rarely encounter repeated disrespect even in chaotic environments. It is not because they are surrounded by better people. It is because their presence communicates closure before conversation even stabilizes. Not hostility, not intimidation. Closure. That distinction matters. Because hostility invites resistance. Closure removes continuation. Now step back and look at what has been unfolding across everything you've heard so far. Each word was not an isolated tool. It was a different expression of the same principle, ending open loops. Disrespect does not survive strength. It survives ambiguity. It survives delayed responses, over-explanations, emotional negotiation, inconsistent tolerance, soft reversals of boundaries, and most importantly, it survives access. Access to your attention after behavior that should have ended it. Once access is removed, behavior reorganizes automatically. But that removal does not need drama. In fact, drama weakens it. Because drama signals emotional involvement, and emotional involvement signals continued relevance. What you are aiming for is not reaction. It is irrelevance of continuation. There is a subtle psychological shift that happens when someone realizes they cannot pull you into extended emotional loops anymore. They stop trying to win interactions and start adjusting their behavior before the interaction even escalates. Not because they respect you in a performative sense, but because unpredictability has been replaced with structure. And structure reduces testing. Now consider something most people overlook. Disrespect is rarely about intention. It is about probability. People act based on what they can get away with repeatedly without consequence or closure. So when your language consistently introduces closure, the probability of testing decreases. Not instantly, but systematically. And over time, your social environment begins to reorganize itself around that consistency. But there is a deeper layer here that most never articulate. When you stop over-explaining yourself, you are not just changing how others perceive you. You are changing how you perceive yourself in real time. Because over-explanation creates internal doubt loops. Each justification reinforces the idea that your position is negotiable. Each unnecessary clarification suggests that your boundary needs external validation. And once that internal structure changes, external behavior follows. That is why this was never about memorizing 7 words. It was about removing the psychological need to extend interactions that should end at recognition. Now, something important happens when this begins to integrate. You start noticing that many conflicts were never real conflicts. They were simply unresolved boundary signals repeating in different forms. Someone interrupts you, and instead of feeling the need to reclaim the moment, you recognize it as a signal. Someone pushes a topic too far, and instead of debating it, you end it structurally. Someone tests tone, and instead of reacting emotionally, you observe whether continuation is even necessary. And slowly, your reactions become fewer, but more precise. That precision is what people experience as authority. Not intensity, not aggression, precision of response. There is also something else that happens, and it is often misunderstood. As your boundaries become clearer, some people will withdraw. Not necessarily because you did anything wrong, but because their access to ambiguity has been removed. People who rely on unclear boundaries for social positioning will naturally resist clarity. Because clarity removes leverage, and what feels like loss is often just exposure of where negotiation was previously being mistaken for connection. That is a difficult realization for many, because it reframes certain relationships not as stable bonds, but as flexible arrangements maintained by tolerance. Once tolerance shifts, the arrangement shifts. But that shift is not collapse. It is correction. Now bring this back to the core idea. The 7 words were never the goal. The goal was removal of the internal habit of extending what should be closed. Because once that habit disappears, language becomes minimal. And when language becomes minimal, presence becomes more authoritative by default. You stop needing to signal respect. It becomes the default response to your structure. And here is the final point most people miss entirely. Real control in communication is not about what you say when tested. It is about how rarely you are placed in situations where testing feels viable in the first place. That only happens when your past responses have already established the cost of ambiguity. Not punishment, not aggression, just structural closure. And when that is consistent, something shifts quietly. You no longer need to prove you deserve respect. You simply stop participating in interactions that require you to negotiate for it. And that is where the transformation completes. Because at that stage, disrespect is no longer something you manage. It is something that stops reaching you in the same form. Not because the world changed, but because your structure did. Now if you follow this to the end, there is a simple next step that continues this chain of awareness. Not as instruction, as continuation. Watch the next lesson, not for more words, for deeper patterns behind them. Because once you begin seeing structure instead of isolated moments, you stop reacting to life and start reading it before it unfolds. Stay in that awareness. That is where control actually begins.